it's a lovely war. What do we want with eggs and ham when we got plums and apple jam? Oh, oh, right, but how do we spend the money we earn? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Poetry Festival for 2017, our third annual Poetry Festival of the North in Padiham. And this year our subject is Edward Thomas and the English war poets. It is, of course, the centenary of Edward Thomas's death, killed at the front in April 1917. So we're commemorating that, but also some of the great war poets of both the First and the Second World Wars. Right, the lecture this evening is by Theresa Sowerby, who was our lecturer last year, if you recall, and its title is Never Such Innocence. She's exploring in particular the impact of the Great War, the First World War, through its poets, in particular the voices of Wilfred Owen and Isaac Rosenberg, who were both killed in action aged 27. And her reader tonight will be herself and also David Rushton once again. So a great pleasure, Theresa, to welcome you back here, and we will now look forward to the first lecture, Never Such Innocence.
Right, thank you everyone. The differently dressed servants with tiny rooms in huge houses, the dust behind limousines, never such innocence, never before or since, has changed itself to past without a word, the men leaving the gardens tidy, the thousands of marriages lasting a little while longer, never such innocence again. These lines from the end of Philip Larkin's poem, 1914, express a traditionally nostalgic view of England before the First World War, before the cataclysmic changes most families would experience, not only as a result of the unprecedented loss of life, but because of the psychological changes to those who returned and famously never spoke of the war. Never such innocence again. But even as he acknowledges the seductive power of the idea of lost innocence, Larkin also suggests that it is perhaps not so simple. To assume that life before 1914 was idyllic is hardly realistic, and the exigencies of war were a catalyst for social change. Larkin's differently dressed servants, for one, would decrease in number, and women, after serving as nurses or working in munitions factories, would be reluctant to return to full-time domesticity. Vera Brittain, in her memoir, Testament of Youth, eloquently conveys the impact of war on a personal level. From a prosperous middle-class family, she left her sought-after place at Somerville College, Oxford, to become a VAD. She lost her brother Edward, her fiancé Roland Leighton, and two other close male friends in the war. She devotes several pages to a description of a last prize-giving at Uppingham, the school attended by her brother and future fiancé, reflecting elegically that it was a summer idyll of carefree entertainment before the flood, lovely legacy of a vanished world. Never for me or for my generation was there to be any festival of joy that no cloud would darken and no remembrance invalidate. Later, she would observe to her mother that, "It seems to me the war will make a very big division between before and after in the history of the world." Her own education in numerous military hospitals, including in Malta and at Etaples, where she nursed both Allies and German soldiers, caused her to reflect on the traditional segregation of the sexes and the assumption that women needed to be kept innocent, especially in matters regarding sex. Observing tartly the taboo around mentioning venereal disease, known coyly in the press as the secret plague, and describing how she watched a soldier's convulsions as he struggled in the terminal stages of syphilis. After nursing the dying, in her own words, replacing intestines and stopping hemorrhages, she became intimate with the frailty of the male body, and there could hardly be a return to the prized innocence in which she had been raised. Britain takes a scalpel to her own emotions to convey this sense of momentous change. Irritated by home concerns about servants and rations, the women, like the men at the front, knew that they had been projected into a world beyond the comforts of home and given a greater knowledge and endurance. Like many, Britain lost the reassurance of her Christian faith in the war, reflecting after her brother's death. "I knew now that death was the end, and I was quite alone. There was no hereafter, no Easter morning, no meeting again." Often, universal emotions are best explored through particular instances. Most touching is Vera Britton's visit to Roland's family, in which she sees his returned clothes, including the uniform in which he was killed. "Those gruesome rags made me realise, as I had never realised before, all that France really meant. The smell of those clothes was the smell of graveyards and death. There was his cap, bent in and shapeless out of recognition, the soft cap he wore rakishly on the back of his head, with the badge thickly covered with mud." Loss of faith, questioning of patriotism, the waste of life, were to occupy poets and artists of the war, and I'd like to focus on the writing of two poets, both vertically challenged, both outside the public school, university-educated class for which officers were traditionally drawn, both eldest sons with adoring mothers, and both dead in 1918, aged respectively 25 and 27 years. Wilfred Owen and Isaac Rosenberg saw themselves as outsiders for different reasons. For both, the experience of trench warfare would lead to an early maturity as writers before their equally early deaths. Let's begin with Owen. Born into a lower middle class family, his father was a railway clerk, Owen was brought up by his strictly evangelical mother, whose desire was for him to enter the church. Owen, with an analytical mind and a tendency to introspection, would quickly come to question the literal truth of biblical narrative in a crisis of faith that he was reluctant to confide to his protective, hypochondriac mother. He was briefly employed as an assistant to a fiercely evangelical vicar, but realising that the ministry was not for him, Owen left his position to travel to France. In Bordeaux, working as a teacher at the Berlitz Language School when the war broke out, he at first distanced himself from it, much more obsessed with his exciting new friendships, poetry, the French decadence, and the realisation that his homosexuality was shared by other cultured and artistic men. But in 1915, feeling the compulsion to sign up, he applied to the Artists' Rifles, where he served as a cadet. After the initial shock, he seems to have changed from being a rather sickly mother's boy, apt to cosset himself and imagine himself ill, into a model, immaculately turned out soldier, proud of his suntan and his new level of physical fitness. He was soon promoted to the officer class as second lieutenant in the 2nd Manchester Rifles. Owen, the eldest child, and given to bossing about his younger siblings, was always a good teacher who enjoyed games and charades, and he quickly became a popular, effective leader. From now on, he would also have a personal servant. Owen's early poetry is heavily influenced by Keats, the French decadence, and the aesthetes, but exposed to the horrors of the front, his religious scepticism and anger at the waste of young life brought a new depth to his verse. He learnt to observe and record carefully the realities of trench life, including the bitter cold of January 1917, when he and his platoon were stranded in snow and ice for days. To his mother, he wrote, "We were marooned on a frozen desert. There is no sign of life on the horizon, and 1,000 signs of death. Not a blade of grass, not an insect. Once or twice a day, the shadow of a big hawk scenting carrion." It also inspired one of his most accomplished poems. In Exposure, he uses a technique that would become a signature of his work. Instead of using full rhyming words, he opts instead for an assonantal rhyme, a rhyme scheme in which the opening and closing consonant sequences of the word remain the same, but the central vowels are different. The effect, one critic described as a note of haunting uneasiness, of frustration and melancholy, which accords perfectly with the theme and mood. For example, in the opening stanza of Exposure, he has the rhymes nivus and nervous, silent and salient. The sense of alienation and timelessness, of the blood slowing and the brain closing down, are conveyed both by this pararhyme and the use of a short last line to each stanza, resulting in a kind of bewildered acceptance. As the senses recede, succumbing to the cold, the guns sound like a dull rumour of some other war. Exposure.
Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us. Wearied, we keep awake because the night is silent. Low drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous, but nothing happens. Watching, we hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. Northward, incessantly, the flickering gunnery rumbles, far off, like a dull rumour of some other war. What are we doing here? The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. We only know war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sag stormy. Dawn, massing in the east, her melancholy army, attacks once more in ranks on shivering ranks of grey. But nothing happens. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence, less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow, with sidelong flowing flakes that flop, pose and renew. We watch them wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance, but nothing happens. Pale flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces, with cringing holes, back on forgotten dreams, and stare snow-dazed deep into grassier ditches. So we drowse, sun-dozed, littered with blossoms, trickling where the blackbird fusses. Is it that we are dying? Slowly our ghosts strike home, glimpsing the sunk fires, glozed with crusted dark red jewels. Crickets jingle there. For hours the innocent mice rejoice. The house is theirs, shutters and doors all closed. On us the doors are closed. We turn back to our dying. Since we believe not otherwise can kind fires burn, nor ever sun smile true on child or field or fruit, for God's invincible spring our love is made afraid. Therefore, not loath, we lie out here, therefore we're born, for love of God seems dying. Tonight, this frost will fasten on this mud and us, shrivelling many hands and puckering foreheads crisp. The burying party, picks and shovels in shaking grasp, pose over half-known faces. All their eyes are ice, but nothing happens.
The portrayal of nature in Exposure is worth noting. It is ignorant of war. The mice are innocent. The men dream they are at home in the sun with flowers and blackbirds. But there is a steely note in all this imagined pastoral, hinted at in the wind's nonchalance. Nature, it seems, is an impersonal force. For the disillusioned Owen, nowhere is this more apparent than in his stunning short poem, Futility. Again, using pararhyme, it pleads a humanist case for the meaning of life, taking as its starting point the contemplation of a dying soldier. It reflects on his farming background, also a powerful metaphor for life and fertility, before moving in the second stanza to a bitter questioning of life's purpose. Like the nonchalant wind, the personified kind old son of stanza 1 becomes in stanza 2 the laconically disengaged, fatuous sunbeams, which should not have troubled to break earth's sleep. We will listen to Futility, followed by a musical setting of the poem from Benjamin Britten's War Requiem. Futility. Move him into the sun. Gently its touch awoke him once, at home, whispering of fields unsown. Always it woke him, even in France, until this morning and this snow. If anything might rise him now, the kind old sun will know. Think how it wakes the seeds, woke once the clays of a cold star. Our limbs so dear achieved, our sides full nerved, still warm, too hard to stir. Was it for this the clay grew tall? Oh, what made fatuous sunbeams toil to break earth's sleep at all?
Into the sun, gently, gently, its touch awoke him once. At home, whispering of field and soul. Always it woke him, even
In the spring of 1917, while stumbling about in the dark in search of a sick soldier, Owen fell into a 15-foot hole, probably an old uncovered cellar. He banged his head and suffered concussion. Nervous and confused, he was taken to Casualty Clearing Station 13 near Amiens. On the 30th of March, he was judged fit to rejoin his battalion, who were engaged in constructing and defending the new Hindenburg Line, a system 5 miles deep with coils of barbed wire, deep tunnels and pillboxes, a literal version of the dark underground world of his poem, Strange Meeting. Wilfred Owen knew his nerve was fragile, but struggled to hold himself together. After days of forced marching in freezing conditions, he took out a night patrol. They were attacked by gas, and he was forced to watch the slow death of one of his men, who'd failed to put on his mask in time. This would later become the abiding image in his famous anti-war poem, Dulce et Decorum Est, and he would always be haunted by it in nightmares. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. Spring 1917. The USA had finally declared war on Germany, and the Battle of Arras began on the 9th of April. Edward Thomas would be killed in the first hour. Days later, Owen led his battalion into a bloody battle, recalled later in his poem, Spring Offensive. The whole army went forward in waves, were bombarded with shells, and replaced by more who were once again exposed and running into enemy fire. He wrote to his mother, "We were caught in an immense tornado of shells. The various waves were all broken up, and we carried on like a crowd moving off a cricket field. When I looked back and saw the ground all crawling and wormy with wounded bodies, I felt no horror at all, but an immense exultation." The adrenaline-fueled exultation would be temporary. It was during the following 9 days that his nerve finally gave way. Asleep one night on a railway bank in Savvy Wood, a huge shell exploded a few yards away from Owen's head, blowing him into the air. A fellow lieutenant, Hubert Gaukrodger, had recently been buried nearby, but the body was disinterred from its shallow grave by the shell and scattered in fragments which surrounded the disoriented poet. Diagnosed with shell shock, or neurasthenia, the medical catch-all word of the period, he was sent home to recover at Craig Lockhart Hospital, where he would form an intense friendship with the older Siegfried Sassoon. Sassoon, war critic and also homosexual, but with an aversion at this point to sex, would introduce Owen to influential London literary figures and to the idea of Uranianism. This was the artist's preferred term for their sexual orientation. And since homosexual acts were illegal, and influenced no doubt by Wilde and by the aesthetes, they regarded themselves as an elite group of outsiders, sensitive, artistic, intellectual, and persecuted. His biographer, Dominic Hibbard, observes that Owen, under the influence of Sassoon, realised his sexuality could be central to his writing without being visible to people who might disapprove. With his famous anti-war statements, which had landed him in Craig Lockhart as being of unsound mind, Sassoon was also instrumental in developing Owen's own stance against the violence of war. One of his most famous poems owes so much to Sassoon in bringing it to fruition that the older poet might be regarded as a kind of literary midwife. Anthem for Doomed Youth began with overtones of jingoism, but in its final form, it is a universal, heartfelt plea to acknowledge the carnage of war. It is a superbly crafted sonnet. The first 8 lines, the octave, set on the battlefield, create a soundscape of trench warfare, with the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle and the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells. These, Owen suggests, are far more fitting funeral rites for the slaughtered soldiers who die as cattle than the conventional passing bells and hymns. But in the sestet, the final 6 lines, the mood changes to elegiac. Still using the extended comparison of traditional funeral rites, Owen replaces candles with the brightness of tears in boys' eyes, the pall with the pallor in the faces of bereaved girls, and the convention of closing the blinds with the act of remembering each dusk. Deprived of the ceremonies of death, the men have the brutal parody of the battlefield noises, coupled with the genuine grief of those who mourn them. Anthem for Doomed Youth.
What passing bells for these who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns, only the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle can patter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries for them, no prayers nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells, and bugles calling for them from sad shires.
What candles may be held to speed them all, not in the hands of boys, but in their eyes, shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. The pallor of girls' brows shall be their pall, their flowers the tenderness of patient minds, and each slow dusk the drawing down of blinds. At Craig Lockhart, Owen was fortunate to be treated by 2 sensitive doctors who recommended that he face and acknowledge his experiences, even using the technique of abreaction or reliving them. They also encouraged him to engage with the outside world, study geology, and visit different areas of Edinburgh, including its slum tenements. It could be argued that his stay at the hospital brought him unprecedented self-knowledge. Though still plagued by nightmares, he nevertheless saw men in a much worse state, as described in mental cases. Who are these? Why sit they here in twilight? Wherefore rock they, purgatorial shadows, drooping tongues from jaws that slob their relish, baring teeth that leer like skulls' tongues wicked, and ever from their hair and through their hand palms misery swelters. Surely we have perished sleeping and walk hell, and who these hellish? A notable symptom of shell shock is the profuse sweating from hands and scalp, something Owen will have experienced at first hand. At Craiglockhart, Owen had the leisure to develop as a poet and contemplate a future after the war. He planned ambitious literary works during this period, including, interestingly, a 3-act play set in a federated Europe, a war-free utopia in the year 2000. Very prescient. Owen's perspective on the war was now that of a pacifist, although he still felt he could not personally refuse to fight. He would later write to his mother that, "I am more and more a Christian, suffer dishonour and disgrace, but never resort to arms, be bullied, be outraged, be killed, but do not kill." This is not a return to the church so much as a reflection on the essential turn the other cheek teaching of Christ, and is echoed in his declaration of poetic intent. My subject is war, and the pity of war. The poetry is in the pity. The philosophical consideration of war involves acknowledgement of the enemy's humanity. Vera Brittain tells of impromptu truces between English and German troops where they agreed not to shoot at each other, and the Christmas truce of 1914 has become almost mythical.
At the first light of dawn on Christmas Day, 1914, some German soldiers emerged from their trenches and approached the Allied lines across no man's land, calling out, "Merry Christmas, Tommy," in their enemy's native tongues. At first, the Allied soldiers feared it was a trick, but seeing the Germans unarmed, they climbed out of their trenches and shook hands with the enemy soldiers. Hearing a familiar tune, but in a foreign tongue, one of the soldiers recognized the famous carol.
Later, they would share cigarettes and rations before fighting resumed the next day. Owen's poem, Strange Meeting, with sinister echoes of Dante's Inferno, imagines a hallucinatory encounter with a dead enemy soldier and features many obsessive, recurring elements. A nightmare landscape, staring eyes, haunting pararhyme, and a reflection on the waste of young life. The speaker acknowledges his guilt in killing the soldier. The soldier is his alter ego, and in the line, "I am the enemy you killed, my friend," there are erotic overtones of Oscar Wilde in the Ballad of Reading Gaol. Each man kills the thing he loves. The aggressor and the enemy are one, and there is a desired rest from the horrors of war in the final, incomplete line, "Let us sleep now." Strange meeting. It seemed that out of battle I escaped, down some profound long tunnel, long since scooped, through granites which titanic wars had groined. Yet also there encumbered sleepers groaned, too fast in thought or death to be bestirred. Then, as I probed them, one sprang up and stared, with piteous recognition in fixed eyes, lifting distressful hands as if to bless, and by his smile I knew that sullen hall. By his dead smile I knew we stood in hell. With 1,000 fears that vision's face was grained, yet no blood reached there from the upper ground, and no guns thumped or down the flues made moan. "Strange friend," I said, "here is no cause to mourn." "None," said the other, "save the undone years, the hopelessness. Whatever hope was yours was my life also. I went hunting wild after the wildest beauty in the world, which lies not calm in eyes or braided hair, but mocks the steady running of the hour, and if it grieves, grieves richlier than here. For by my glee might many men have laughed, and of my weeping something had been left, which must die now. I mean the truth untold, the pity of war, the pity war distilled. Now men will go content with what we spoiled, or discontent, boil bloody and be spilled. They will be swift with the swiftness of the tigress. None will break ranks, though nations trek from progress. Courage was mine, and I had mystery. Wisdom was mine, and I had mastery. To miss the march of this retreating world into vain citadels that are not walled. Then, when much blood had clogged their chariot wheels, I would go up and wash them from sweet wells, even with truths that lie too deep for taint. I would have poured my spirit without stint, but not through wounds, not on the cess of war. Foreheads of men have bled where no wounds were. I am the enemy you killed, my friend. I knew you in this dark, for so you frowned yesterday, through me as you jabbed and killed. I parried, but my hands were loath and cold. Let us sleep now. Nevertheless, despite his abhorrence of war, Owen was also troubled by the idea that he had been thought cowardly. Judged fit to leave Craiglockhart, he went for training in Scarborough in November 1917, where he recalls being sent new teenage recruits from Lancashire mill towns. He describes them as awful specimens, green pale, but hoped that he and his fellow NCOs would turn them into mahogany swashbucklers, a kind of military redemption. He returned to the front in September 1918, and leaving his mother for the last time, quoted a line from Rabindranath Tagore: "When I go from hence, let this be my parting word, that what I have seen is unsurpassable." His new servant, a young man called Jones, seemed to bring out in Owen all the complex feelings that he had experienced for other youths and boys. A mixture, as he said himself, of the paternal, the fraternal, and the amative. The erotic charge in his idealised feelings towards young men is present, if disguised, in much of his work. Jones seems to have been fond of Owen, who was now made the battalion's bombing officer. And when Jones was shot in the head, presumably defending Owen, he sat for 2 hours nursing the injured boy before the stretcher bearers came. The result, as he reported later to Sassoon, left a deep impression. First, he asked Sassoon to imagine the crimson hot iron as it cools from the smelting. This is what Jones's blood looked like and felt like. My senses are charred. But after Jones was taken to hospital, Wilfred, his tunic soaked in Jones's blood, seemed to have been possessed by a kind of madness. He writes, "I lost all my earthly faculties, and I fought like an angel. I captured a German machine gun and scores of prisoners." Fought like an angel, an avenging one it would seem. Captain Taylor, his CO, wrote that Owen had shown great coolness throughout, and his energetic devotion to duty is worthy of the highest praise. He personally manipulated a captured machine gun in an isolated position and inflicted considerable losses on the enemy. Throughout, he behaved most gallantly. Interestingly, Owen insisted in a letter to his mother that he had killed only one German soldier. The image he presented to her would be an edited one. Later, posthumously, he would be awarded the Military Cross. More importantly, though, he had now proved his courage. He'd always been exceptionally close to and dependent on Susan for approval and for emotional support. But letters to his mother from now on show affection without signs of this earlier dependence, and he was confidently coming into his own as a poet. Praised by leading writers of the day, everything was looking hopeful. But as the war was coming to an end, the Manchesters were in Busigny to clear the roads. The spirit was one of camaraderie and no great danger, as Owen wrote to Susan. On November the 4th, as his company were taking planks to repair a bridge, Wilfred Owen would be hit and killed. 7 days later, the war was over. Church bells rang throughout the country. As they were ringing in Shrewsbury, Susan and Tom Owen received a telegram announcing their son's death.
braved the wood and went and took the fire with him and the knife. And as they sojourned both of them together, Isaac, the firstborn, spake and said, My father, my father.
Again, from Britain's War Requiem, we've just listened to a setting of Owen's poem, The Parable of the Old Man and the Young, in which the Old Testament story of Abraham and Isaac is given a bitter contemporary twist. Abraham prepares to sacrifice his son, is offered in his place the ram of pride, but instead of accepting the substitute, the patriarch, representing the politicians and generals, slew half the seed of Europe one by one. The Old Testament reference is relevant to our next poet, another Isaac, whose life would be forfeit. Isaac Rosenberg's parents were Jewish immigrants from Lithuania. His father was a peddler, his mother a needlewoman. Their first son, he had a twin who died at birth, and the idea of a shadow self would haunt much of his work. Rosenberg was a small boy with a weak chest. His mother claimed that at birth you could have put him in a jug. He grew up with his 4 siblings in a couple of rooms in Whitechapel, in an East End slum that would be romanticised by Owen, who saw a young man there he described as the Limehouse Beauty. The reality of life there was, of course, less charming. Money and food were scarce, and the boys and men of the family shared one family suit, which each would wear for special occasions. Not sure what happened for weddings and funerals when all the men needed to turn up. Thanks, however, to some rich patrons and the Jewish Educational Aid Society, Rosenberg's talent, initially as an artist, was fostered by an apprenticeship to an engraver and later a place at the Slade. Here, along with David Bomberg and Mark Gertler, he would become part of the Whitechapel Group, a band of Jewish men and women who espoused a passionate, pacifist modernism. Later, anxious for the health of his lungs in the London smog, he would go off to South Africa to live in Cape Town briefly with his married sister. Like Owen, Rosenberg was abroad when the war broke out, and he seems to have regarded it rather as a nuisance than something that would have an impact on him and his family. His parents were both pacifists, and he wrote to Edward Marsh from Cape Town, "Know that I despise and hate war, and hope that Kaiser William will have his bottom smacked, a naughty, aggressive schoolboy who will have all the plum pudding." Returning to England, however, unable to find work, Rosenberg reluctantly joined the army, being allocated at 5'2" to one of the new Bantam regiments for men under 5'3" who would previously not have been accepted. The physically puny Rosenberg, a private soldier with none of the officer's privileges, there certainly wouldn't be any servants or chef-cooked meals for him, found himself among men who, although small, were often from mining communities and were frighteningly fit and strong. One Highland Bantam regiment was known as the Devil's Dwarves. However, the Bantams were able to laugh at themselves, as is evident from their anthem, the Bantam Sodgers. Now, it's sung to the tune of the Church's One Foundation, so if you want to try it at home, you heard it first here. It goes like this. "We are the Bantam Sodgers, a short-arse company. We have no height, we cannot fight, what bloody good are we? And when we get to Berlin, the Kaiser he will say, Hoch, hoch, mein Gott, what a bloody fine lot is the Bantam Company." You see, we promised you poetry, we don't disappoint. Poet and artist, Rosenberg would always be fascinated by the possibilities of the self-portrait as a way of being both objective and subjective, externalizing emotions and holding them up for scrutiny. And he would adopt similar techniques in his poetry. He made some arresting sketches of himself in uniform and in the trenches. However, no one could have been less temperamentally suited to the life of a soldier. One officer called him hopeless. Rosenberg had always had an uneasy relationship with authority, and his dreamy, otherworldly demeanour got him into trouble constantly for failing to obey orders or to have his uniform spotless. Given new boots, he ignored the advice to soften them with dubbing, and as a result was crippled by sores and blisters. But, I would argue, this brutal regime seems to have had an effect on him, not unlike the incident in which Owen, having nursed his servant for 2 hours, came out transformed into a fearless fighter. Except that Rosenberg's army-trained physical toughness was not to be shown on the battlefield. but would be channeled with an emotional ruthlessness into a handful of remarkable poems. Always the artist, Rosenberg, who had entered the war for pragmatic reasons to earn money and support his mother, was determined to milk the experience of all its horrors and exhilaration in the service of his poetry. He wrote, "I will not leave one corner of my consciousness covered up, but saturate myself with the strange and extraordinary new conditions of this life, and it will all refine itself into poetry later on." And in a letter to Edward Marsh, said that when composing poems, "I have a way when I write to try to put myself into the situation, and I make gestures and grimaces." Bet that didn't go down too well with the sergeant majors. Rosenberg's painterly eye is everywhere visible in his poems, and of particular interest in the remarkable louse hunting. For the private soldier, lice were almost as much of a torment as the shells. Letters home beg for something called Harrison's pomade, which was apparently helpful. But a more desperate remedy was to try to burn eggs out of clothes with a candle or a lighted cigarette. This poem is based on a drawing made by the poet of an actual louse hunt he witnessed, which his friend Gordon Bottomley described as all moving lines like a witch's sabbath of long, slim bodies, as though Botticelli had gone mad and designed a naked ballet for Russian dancers. The poem is indeed like an energetic verbal rendition of a painting by Goya or Daumier. Full of dynamic verbs and distorted images, it begins with the startling line, "Nudes, stark and glistening," before bringing alive the hunt in a bacchanalian ecstasy, or, in the poet's own words, a demon pantomime. The hurtling free verse invites the reader to observe, see gargantuan hooked fingers, while simulating the frenzied actions of the soldiers. The colloquial verb smutch is used to describe squashing the lice and stands out from the more mock-heroic language. But then the revels subside into a deeper consciousness of the backdrop of war. The soldiers have been roused from a place where their ears were lulled by the dark music blown from sleep's trumpet. The dark music suggesting the sleep of death. Louse hunting. Nudes, stark and glistening, yelling in lurid glee, grinning faces and raging limbs, whirl over the floor one fire. For a shirt verminously busy, yon soldier tore from his throat, with oaths Godhead might shrink at, but not the lice. And soon the shirt was aflare over the candle he'd lit while we lay. Then we all sprang up and stripped to hunt the verminous brood. Soon, like a demon's pantomime, the place was raging. See the silhouettes agape, see the gibbering shadows mixed with the battled arms on the wall. See gargantuan hooked fingers pluck in supreme flesh to smutch supreme littleness. See the merry limbs in hot Highland fling, because some wizard vermin charmed from this quiet, this revel, when our ears were half lulled by the dark music blown from sleep's trumpet. In a Telegraph review of Rosenberg's biography, Nigel Jones observed the fact the poet's first language was Yiddish, he learnt English aged 8, may have contributed to his distinctive style, which Jones describes as a way with words that takes the form of a wildly creative grappling. The poet, Lawrence Binyon, remarked that he instinctively thought in images and did not sufficiently understand the limitations of language. Like many of Rosenberg's contemporaries, Binyon did not recognise the revolutionary experiments this poet was making in finding his voice on the battlefield. Experiments that would result in exquisitely structured poems, in sinuous free verse that defy reduction or paraphrase. Rosenberg seems aware himself that the experience of war, though devastating, could transform the man and the artist. After his first month in France, he wrote to Harold Schiff, "One might succumb, be destroyed, but one might also, and the chances are even greater, be renewed, made larger, healthier." The energy and intensity suggested here is present in the immediacy of his poems set in France. Unlike Owen and Sassoon, he rarely passed moral comments on what he described, but instead sought to embody the horror in images, symbols, and distinctive rhythms of his increasingly experimental verse. As his biographer, Jean Moorcroft Wilson, writes, he had from the outset an acute awareness of the disruption and chaos looming, and not just for the ordinary soldier. The time was out of joint for almost everyone, and his ability to convey this sense of dislocation is one of his greatest gifts as a poet. A brief discussion of two poems serves to illustrate this. In a short poem, Marching, he conveys the feeling of alienation in the close ranks of private soldiers on the move. My eyes catch ruddy necks, sturdily pressed back, all a red brick moving glint, like flaming pendulums, hands swing across the khaki, mustard-coloured khaki, to the automatic feet. The individual is subsumed in the mechanical formation of the march, reminiscent of his friend Mark Gertler's frightening painting, The Merry-Go-Round. Hands become pendulums and feet are automatic. While working with the engineers, one of Rosenberg's jobs was to drive out over no man's land on the limber trucks to set up barbed wire barricades. The gruesome reality of this is that it involved driving over the bodies of dead soldiers, a situation he brilliantly conveys in Dead Man's Dump, a poem full of strong condensed images, which ends with Rosenberg imagining the last thoughts of one man who is still barely alive. But this poet's dead don't lie down in quite the way Owen's do. There is always a sense of the numinous about them, not angelic perhaps so much as demonic. In this poem, Rosenberg would also introduce an idea that was to preoccupy him of a female deity or force that is at once mother, lover, and the source of death. Here are 3 stanzas which give a taste of this. The wheels lurched over sprawled dead, but pained them not, though their bones crunched. Their shut mouths made no moan. They lie there, huddled, friend and foeman, man born of man and born of woman, and shells go crying over them from night till night and now. Earth has waited for them, all the time of their growth, fretting for their decay. Now she has them at last, in the strength of their strength, suspended, stopped and held. Maniac earth, howling and flying, your bowels seared by the jagged fire, the iron love, the impetuous storm of savage love. Dark earth, dark heavens, swinging in chemic smoke, what dead are born when you kiss each soundless soul, with lightning and thunder from your mind heart, which man's self dug and his blind fingers loosed. The violence becomes a savage love. The dead are born when the earth kisses each soundless soul. In his poem Daughters of War, Rosenberg's personal favourite, the daughters are conceived as Amazonian spirits, each waiting for her earthly lover to pass through death and be claimed by her. They are dangerous, seductive, erotic, as seen in the opening lines. Space beats the ruddy freedom of their limbs, their naked dances with man's spirit naked by the root side of the tree of life. The soldiers' corroding faces must be broken so that the soul can leap out, and at the end is the voice of one of the daughters. My sisters have their males, clean of the dust of old days that clings about those white hands and yearns in those voices sad. Is there an ominous sense that the remaining daughter is waiting for the poet to be her consort? While Owen, through losing his Christian faith, came to assert passionately, despite this, Christ's teaching to turn the other cheek and to depict soldiers as sacrificial victims, Rosenberg seems to have moved from the idea of a patriarchal deity to this concept of the female as both origin of life and dealer of death. His earth is not a geological mass, but a hungry female, terrifying but erotic, and possibly a gateway into a transcendental hereafter. The last poem we shall consider is Rosenberg's most famous. The meticulous attention to detail is characteristic of the poet and can be seen in the fact that it started as metrically regular, rather a formal poem, before emerging as the haunting, tightly structured, free-verse meditation it has as its final form. He was acutely aware of a poem as almost a separate being, a form of alchemy perhaps, something that must be allowed to grow organically. He put this idea eloquently in a letter to his friend Sonia Cohen. How earnestly one must wait on ideas. You cannot coax real ones to you. And let, as it were, a skin grow naturally round them and through them. The poem not only explores, but must also embody the idea in its language and rhythms. In Break of Day, time is seen as a druid, saluting the dawn as darkness, a physical entity, crumbles away. We are in the moment, and two symbols, the rat and the poppy, run through the poem. Symbols because they are both literally there and resonant of much that lies beyond. The rat has been compared to the poet himself. With its cosmopolitan sympathies, it moves readily from one side to the other, just as Rosenberg, born of immigrant Jews, himself stateless, was not patriotic. The rat, also a representative of nature, is questioned about what it sees. In an echo of Blake's The Tiger, Rosenberg asks, "What quaver, what heart aghast?" before returning to the poppy with the stunning line, "Poppies whose roots are in men's veins," an image which defies logic, but seems to utter an inspired truth symbolically, linking the red of the ubiquitous poppies with the blood that sustains life but will be spilt. Rosenberg cannot have imagined how potent and universal a symbol his poppy would become. He begins by picking the flower and ends with it tucked behind his ear, safe for the present, but a little white with dust. Again, a literal, grounded understatement that links to the opening, crumbling darkness. The circular structure of the poem hints at man's origin and end in the earth, dust to dust. Break of day in the trenches.
The darkness crumbles away. It's the same old druid time as ever. Only a live thing leaves my hand, a queer sardonic rat, as I pull the parapet's poppy to stick behind my ear. Droll rat, they would shoot you if they knew your cosmopolitan sympathies. Now you have touched this English hand, you will do the same to a German soon, no doubt, if it be your pleasure to cross the sleeping green between. It seems you inwardly grin as you pass strong eyes, fine limbs, haughty athletes, less chance than you for life, bombs to the whims of murder, sprawled in the bowels of the earth, the torn fields of France. What do you see in our eyes at the shrieking iron and flame hurled through still heavens? What quaver, what heart aghast? Poppies whose roots are in man's veins drop and are ever dropping, but mine in my ear is safe, just a little white with the dust.
Having just finished a night patrol, Isaac Rosenberg was killed on the night of April the 1st, 1918. He was first buried in a mass grave, but in 1926, the unidentified remains of 6 of the King's Own Royal Lancashire soldiers were individually reinterred in Calais. Rosenberg's gravestone is marked with his name and the words, "Buried near this spot, artist and poet." Poetry flourished during the First World War, speaking, it seems, to everyone on both the home front and abroad fighting. One record has 50,000 poems published in magazines in 1914 alone. I'd like to finish by bringing together poetry and music as a way of remembering those who died. Though dating from 1896, A.E. Housman's collection, A Shropshire Lad, published in a cheap pocketbook edition, accompanied many soldiers to the battlefield. Its haunting pastoral lament for a lost world and lost youth spoke eloquently of what they felt themselves to be going through. Never such innocence, indeed. Let's close with one, as we're running out of time, of Housman's poems set by Ralph Vaughan Williams, the final one in the sequence, Clun.
springs of rivers by Bonny and Team and Clan, the country for easy livers, the quietest under the sun. We still had sorrows to lighten, one could not be always glad, and lads knew trouble at nighten when I was a nighten lad. By bridges the Thames runs under, in London the town built hill. 'Tis sure small matter for wonder if sorrow is with one still, and if as a lad grows older the trouble he bears are more. He carries his griefs on a shoulder that answered them long before. Where shall one halt to deliver this luggage I'd leave set down? Not Thames nor Thames the river, nor London, nor night and the town. Is a long way further than Nighton, a quieter place than Clan, where doomsday may thunder and lighten, and little 'twill matter to
Thank you very much to Theresa for a very moving and terrific talk on First World War poets, giving us the background of the First World War, looking in detail at two of its greatest poets, Wilfred Owen and Isaac Rosenberg. And as ever with Theresa, looking in detail, bringing out the poetry, the way the poetry works, and bringing it alive for us tonight. So a very big hand of thanks to Theresa.